Thank you, Gregory, and thank you, all of you, for making me feel so incredibly welcome. I feel, really honoured by Gregory's comments, and I have to say it's been an extraordinary pleasure to spend 3 days in Saskatoon. Of course, the real reason for my coming was to discover the birthplace of Agnes Martin, but at the same time, I've discovered this extraordinary museum, which has so much potential. I'm going to enjoy watching it grow and thrive. My story at Tate begins with a prison, Milbank Prison, built in 1812 on the north side of the river Thames, in its own time an exemplary model. It was a version of a panopticon designed around observation and supervision, and with everything visible from a central point. It had 15,000 cells, several miles of corridors, and it was a proud pioneer of solitary confinement. Of course, museums date from the same era. They also take things out of the world. They rob them of their context. They scrutinise them and categorise them, look after them for their own good, keep records of their provenance and put them into categories of value. Like prisons, they are part of the apparatus of civil society, conferring and safeguarding our rights as citizens. And incidentally, the term keeper, think prison or zoo, he who holds the key, was also the term that preceded that of curator at Tate. So my first role in the institution was assistant keeper. So the Tate itself was founded in 1897, the child of a marriage between private philanthropy, Sir Henry Tate, and the British government. And like so many first-era museums, its physical manifestation evoked the Greek or Roman temple, embodying enlightenment, values of reason and learning, combining a belief in the intrinsic value of art and public benefit of access to culture, all things that we continue to hold dear. Collecting was at the heart of the museum's mission, and for the first years of its life, this was undertaken by London's Royal Academicians, here depicted by Johann Zoffany, actually a century earlier, but things moved very slowly in those days. And from the Renaissance onwards, it's worth remembering that teaching based in the academies focused on the genre system, history painting, the memorialisation of great political events and religious narratives was the most highly prized, followed by portraiture, still life, and then landscape. And it was above all, as you can see, a male domain. Women were excluded, not just from the academy, but even from its life drawing classes. And at the time when Tate was founded, were still excluded, thus rendering it incapable of taking part and taking on the grand subjects of history painting, and therefore unlikely to qualify for election as academicians. Incredibly, the first female member of the Academy was elected only in 1936, and she was Laura Knight, and this is her self-portrait with a nude, a painting she made in 1913, following an art school training in which she had not been allowed into the life drawing classes. I think she did pretty well, but critics were repelled at that stage, 1913, at the idea of a woman painting a naked woman. I mention this in passing because the history of women's exclusion from art, the art world, and from the collection is the history of women's exclusion from all forms of social, economic and political elites. And their second-rate status helps, I think, understand why so few of them feature as major players in the history of modern art. But if we fast forward from then to the late 1980s, when I joined Tate as a fledgling keeper, the collection was of British art from 1500 to the present day and of modern foreign art, as it was then known. It had grown in a very fitful manner, very poorly funded, and growing in response as much as the initiatives and tastes, but also the kind of prejudices and deficiencies of Tate directors, curators and patrons, and reflecting, kind of in essence, I suppose London's parochialism, its proximity to Paris, and its strategic position in the migratory path of European émigré artists in the 1930s, and of course then its post-war deference to the United States in artistic matters. Like almost all museums of modern art in Europe and America in the 20th century, it adapted Alfred Barr's schematic timeline of the evolution of modern art. Alfred Barr was the founding director of MoMA in New York, And he was really the first one to set out a very compelling narrative of how the world got to abstraction. We effectively like many museums, adopted this as a route map, which we followed in constructing our own history of art. And therefore, shortly before I arrived at Tate, the retiring keeper of the modern collection was able to state with a degree of extraordinary degree of confidence, I think, that the Tate had finally built up a fully representative collection of foreign art with the representation of all the major movements and with the greatest artists each represented by several works. My arrival at the Tate was swiftly followed and actually overshadowed by that of a dynamic and charismatic new director, the young Nicholas Sirota, whose first major task, self-appointed, was a reinstallation of the collection. That was a really radical act in those days. If you think that the keeper felt that there was a complete collection and very proudly demonstrated that in the galleries. So to take that out and rehang it was an extraordinarily bold move. But if you look at that installation, you can see here Nick's handwritten scheme for the collection. This is pre-computer days. You'll see how, with the eyes of today, how incredibly conservative it seemed. There are very few women. There are no artists from outside the NATO canon. The principal movements are represented. There's a predominance of American and in particular German art that was really hot in the marketplace. And then all the kind of major British figures, Moore, Bacon, are pulled out as superstars. But the idea of rehanging, rethinking the past in light of the present, that was interesting. The idea of curatorial agency was a provocation. And I really remember the feeling of incredible excitement as we keepers unlocked the doors, we threw off our metaphorical uniforms and we emerged as modern curators. But this rehang was redundant before it was even complete. Claims for a more complex and inclusive art history were beginning to surface, not just from the universities, but also from artists and audiences. Claims of exclusion by artists. And I want to share with you a picture of the late Helen Chadwick, an artist I got to know well in the 80s. I loved the way she just took hold of the minimalist cube and impressed her body on it, taking and gendering American minimalism. But of course, Gregory mentioned the Guerrilla Girls, but they were strutting their stuff at this time. And it's, how many years is that? 30 years. And at the same time, there was a new generation of black artists demanding their place in art history. And this is an installation of the work of Pakistan-born Rashid Areen, who is just now getting the recognition he deserves. Here were alliances built around race and gender and what we called the new art history, post-colonial theory. There was a real shift from criticism to critical theory. So as visitors walked around Tate's beautiful rehang, the institution was kind of changing from within. And that was less reflected in the collection, but in the programme and in the activity, the kind of curated space. And it was no longer a place of sanctuary for a privileged selection of the greatest art, but a place of living endeavour. The Turner Prize was new. A new commissioning space called the Art Now Room was started up. There were big survey exhibitions of contemporary art, acquisitions of large-scale video, installation, artworks reflecting the proliferation of biennials and the international commissioning programmes they involved. And these were the drivers behind the trustees' decision to find a second site in London. A master plan we commissioned internally in 1992 called for a new type of museum. It acknowledged the limitations of the bar model and called for a postmodern view, which would bring to light work previously disregarded and reflect a more complex history of art. So towards the end of the 90s, when I was appointed, along with Ivona Blaswick and Caro Howell, as the fledgling curatorial team, we felt absolutely charged and kind of indeed empowered to present a new and more complex vision of art for a new century. And this was our raw material, Bankside Power Station, chosen less for its beauty, which wasn't so apparent in those days, than for its proximity to the centre of London and the sheer size of the site. The choice was also interestingly determined by the outcome of a survey. We asked 50 artists some crucial questions to guide us in our thinking, and we asked them to state their preference for Beaux-Arts buildings, postmodern buildings, or industrial spaces, and overwhelmingly they voted for the latter. And the Swiss duo, Herzog and de Meuron, provided a solution which kind of retained a very, very strong attachment to the industrial heritage of the building, notably and you can see it in the plan, retaining that vast turbine hall as a big open covered street along on the, I wonder whether this has got a sort of, there we go, on this side, a stack of what turned into more conventional kind of white cube galleries. And it was this idea of a kind of hybrid model that I think was so interesting to us as curators. And there's something we took on right from the start. We conceived a programme as partly a space for thinking about history through the collection, but also as a space for driving experimentation through commissioning new work. And prior to the opening, we had an extraordinary 2 years of blue skies thinking, and I'm sure that's something that Remai Modern didn't have. We had a project team focusing exclusively on the building, and a curatorial team with absolutely nothing to do other than think about how to tell the story of art in the 20th century. And we worked, first of all, in a very sort of private, privileged, incredibly intimate think tank, and subsequently through a series of consultations with safe friends. And by safe, I mean people who weren't going to leak to the press or tell everybody how uncertain we were feeling. So there were artists, trustees, people involved in learning, a few friendly critics, and so on. And we worked through 5 or 6 scenarios for telling the 20th century. I say sort of blue skies thinking, but of course our ideas were shaped by constraints and ambitions. And the constraints, of course, were the building, that we knew vaguely the shape of the galleries. We knew we were going to have 4 suites of galleries on 2 floors separated by exhibition spaces. And of course the constraints of the collection, which we're beginning to search through and spend time in the stack and pull things out and see what we had to play with. Another constraint was the fact that Tate Modern was going to be the 4th in a family of Tates. So a family of Tates sharing the same organisation, same collection. And then we had to have a collection that could move in and out of the building at relatively short notice. And that as an institution, we are a net borrower and we need to lend our collection as collateral for loans for our temporary exhibitions. We also knew we needed to kind of include postcard works, the works that people will cover many miles and geographies to come and see. And we needed to honour donors. All those were things that we had to absorb and take into account. But we had ambitions too. We had an ambition to be open and accessible, to breathe fresh life into a rather arid history. We wanted to build the display around several histories rather than a single narrative, and to use the displays as context for asking questions, for exploring broader ideas, as well as modernism's style-based isms. But above all, I think we were really interested in the idea that artists and works of art are time travellers. They're not locked into a linear histories. Artists don't just seek inspiration from the previous generation. They're not just looking over their shoulders thinking, I need to go a bit further. As is suggested by Barr's timeline of kind of action and reaction. But artists do pick and choose. They plunder and loot, and works of art themselves are made at one moment in time with the history of that moment, but they go out into the world and they're received and responded to subsequently at many different moments. So they have many histories that accrue over time. They change over time. They open up over time. Sometimes they close down over time. Their relevance or their importance shifts in and out of focus. I remember around this time, the completely inspirational cultural theorist Stuart Hall gave a lecture at the Old Tate Gallery, now Tate Britain, and all of us involved in the endeavour were there. And he spoke of a need for museums of modern art to understand their collections as temporary stabilisations. So to be aware and explicit about their inclusions and exclusions, and to see them as kind of shifting the nature of truth and value. And I think that was an incredibly important lesson to us, not just about the collection, but about how you drive a museum, that at any one time it's just a temporary stabilisation that reflects the context in which you're operating, your audience's values and truths, but that will change and shift over time. And to be open to that is really the nature of curatorial practice. So we moved away from the safety net of a single art history, exposing ourselves and indeed our audiences to risk and uncertainty. And for a while, after the exhilaration of the opening parties, the backlash against our massively over-curated departure from chronology, it did seem as if we'd taken a risk or two too far. The displays were organised around a thematic framework. It was rooted in that old-fashioned idea of genre that comes from those academies, a particular subject matter, but we expanded those 4 subjects to embrace the scope of artistic endeavour. So the expanded field of art practice, it was all about opening up. We wanted to open those dialogues between past and present, rather than present them as opposite ends of a continuum. And we wanted to take down the traditional museum barriers between media. Artists for many years have been working across media, not confined to the easel or the plinth, but working with photography and video alongside sculpture and painting. And we wanted to respect a number of very different styles of looking. The kind of temple style. On the top left-hand corner, there's our Rothko room. We call this is, some of our visitors weep in this room, so this is a room for weepers, but that's absolutely fine. Underneath that, we have a kind of complex and scholarly installation of surrealism. It's a kind of thinking room, an installation style. And then here, and this is a kind of typology of display that we very much foregrounded at the New Tate Modern, and these were dialogues where we brought works of art from different places or different temporalities in dialogue. So here the kind of abrupt juxtaposition in some ways of Monet's Water Lilies, a really much loved iconic work in the National Collection, with a new installation done by Richard Long, a mud painting with all the liquidity and open landscape that suggests, and then a floor piece by Richard Long. And we were very clear about why we were doing this, to help people who, Monet lovers, to understand a kind of relationship in art between the expansiveness of the painting and the expansiveness of Richard's vision. And likewise, we wanted people who were interested in Richard Long to understand that his work is rooted in a more traditional conception of landscape. But of course, this kind of juxtaposition was seen as absolutely abhorrent by many traditionalists. So we kind of, the other thing about this opening display, that we wanted to do this not just as Tate, as with the authority of the institution, but actually as people, real positions, with genders, with points of view, with names, with ages, etc. So the very first time we began signing our wall text, so everybody knew who was responsible for each display. So we kind of thought of this as a laboratory style installation, continuously inflected by room changes. The solo rooms changed every 6 months, the thematics every year. We did a major rethink in 2007, which is another story. But it actually did prove a remarkably robust model. And once our visitors got used to it, it was enduringly popular. But several tensions were at play in moving our thinking forward behind the scenes, so to speak. So the most public of those tensions, it wasn't even a tension, a kind of something about the way the building was evolving, was the evolution of the Turbine Hall as a place. This is where we did our big commissions once a year. But it was a place where new art and the public together found a way of interacting. And this was in some ways completely unforeseen. It partly happened because we had to use the turbine hall for other things, but it also really, I think, emerged because of a real desire for greater engagement in the museum from our audiences as a place of experimentation and culture, but also crucially as a social space and what you might even call a useful space. Then there was the kind of tension that was happening in the curatorial team, and that was our own really shocking awareness as London in the early years of the 21st century became more and more of a diverse demographic of a city, was actually just how parochial our collection was. Given the increasing international exposure of art in multiple contexts around the world. So we would be going off to biennials in Havana and Sao Paulo and art fairs in Delhi and Hong Kong, but coming back and working with a collection that was really bound by this geography. So a small technicality here is that Tate's collection was still at this time managed by a collection team which actually had no relationship with Tate Modern. So it was like a library that we borrowed from, and it was based at Milbank at the old Tate. So while we were having great fun exposing the limitations of the collection, actually we had no future over its development. So over that decade, we actually met that geographical challenge, not through collecting, but through exhibitions. And this is just a slide of 3 of the exhibitions that kind of provided a pathway. Exhibitions such as Time Zones and Commonwealth, which were big international survey shows, bringing to Tate some of the works that we encountered on those international exploratory trips, so representing artists working very much outside the Western canon. But more importantly, and the catalogue in the centre of this slides shows you an exhibition that we did in 2001 called Century City. And it was an exhibition that looked at creativity in the metropolis in 9 global cities at different moments in time, kind of flashpoints, kind of crucible moments of cultural change across the course of the 20th century. And the fact that these included Lagos, Mumbai, Rio and Tokyo, alongside cities very traditionally cited as the kind of foundation points of modernism, proposed a recognition of Tate's history and other museums' histories as histories of institutional exclusion or neglect. Other exhibitions, of course, looked at other areas of neglect. Photography, for example, we had not collected. New media, performance, and, as I said earlier, women. In 2007, thankfully and finally, the reins of the collection building were finally handed over to the team at Tate Modern, and I was able to move from head of displays to director of collections international art with a clear remit, because I set out my vision at my interview, to deliver a collection reflective of the diversity of 21st century art and, more crucially, to reshape Tate's historic collection in light of those exclusions. The one but was that I had no money to do this with. But, and I know that those of you who are in this room will appreciate the importance of philanthropy. So over the course of 10 years, we constructed a financial support structure, but it was much more than that. It was a group of people from the various regions that we were targeting for our acquisitions, all of whom were passionate about culture and art in those countries and who wanted to support the growth of culture in those countries by supporting Tate to represent those regions in our national collection. And that support structure helped us build curatorial expertise, and it also established an incredible network of influencers and collaborators. And that structure is still in place, and to this day I remain indebted to those about 350 people that organogram represents. Our strategy was very simply not to do everything. In fact, what we did was very, very selective. We decided to acquire very strong contemporary work, regardless of geography, but with a particular interest in work that spoke of its local origin. So alongside this, we've worked to revise, extend, and complicate our understandings of modern art and modernism by complementing the existing collection by works that can be seen in dialogue. So it wasn't about creating separate collections of African art or art from the Asia Pacific region or Latin American, but a network of art history. And so we were particularly interested in those art practices that you might describe as hybrid or syncretic or composite. So examples of artists who have been in contact with other cultures and whose work has developed in light of that contact. So, I risk gross simplification here, but we're talking about artists who expand our understanding of the modern. We also looked at established artists with mature careers and emerging talents of really exceptional interest, whose radical practices we hope will shape the future direction of the collection. I just will give you that's where we are now. Just to give you a couple of snapshots, thinking about African art. I mentioned in relation to each region, to think about the emergence of the modern, the emergence of a kind of mature notion of what it means to be an African artist. And Ibrahim El Salah, Sudanese modernist, is an absolutely exemplary artist of that kind. He was born in the Sudan, he was educated at the Slade, and while in England, he not only embraced the work of Francis Bacon, but through Francis Bacon, the legacy of Picasso, and through Picasso took him back to his own continental relationship to African tribal art. And he very self-consciously, with a group of contemporaries, worked towards building a kind of modern art for Africa. And it's absolutely hybrid. You can see all those references in it. And it's a vast painting. The paint incorporates sand, it speaks of the desert and aridity, and it speaks of a kind of taking hold of European modernism and taking ownership of it. And it's been an absolutely pivotal work in helping us understand what it means to talk about global art history. We're not talking about one history, we're talking about many interconnected stories. A mature artist who has significant mileage behind him, museum quality, Meshach Garba from Benin, a work made over a period of 5 years, seminal work articulating what might be different about an African museum for the 21st century. If Ibrahim El Salah made paintings that shows what might be different about African modernism, Garba's work inflects the notion of the institution. And this work, a series of 12 rooms, each of which setting up a different type of museum experience, kind of acted a bit like a Trojan horse for Tate. As the work embraced life and living, it includes a room to get married in. It includes a room where you can hire a bicycle. It includes a room where people can build their own architecture out of building blocks. So reflecting very much a sense of sort of African engagement with performance and ritual. So life, living, interactivity, bringing those into the museum, into the collection. Hitherto, they would be restricted to our education spaces. So really changing the way we operate in a way we had never done before. And then the third African work I just want to cite, in a way because it's typical of the way we can bring into the museum really dynamic new practices. Nicholas Hobo, young South African sculpture, work looks like nothing we had ever seen before, made with materials that we'd never worked with before. It's made out of old tyres sewn together, absolutely stinks, but it's a striking extension of the language of sculpture in the collection. We were really at that time also beginning a very concerted attempt to bring down some of those barriers between media, acquire more work by women, and as we began to look at overlook women's practices, inevitably that led us to working with different ways of making art, because women have kind of excelled in the margins. So many of them have felt not empowered to work with easel painting or traditional sculpture, but have adopted ways of, practices where they have been able to take kind of agency. So Suzanne Lacy was an important acquisition in that respect. This is a work of hers called Crystal Quilt. She's an important feminist artist from the West Coast America. But in order to adequately reflect her practice, we had to acquire not only the documentation of the performance, but at Suzanne's insistence, the quilt, that all our instincts said put it in the archive, but no, it's a work of art, the first fabric work, the first fibre work, the first craft work to enter the collection. But we also had to promise for Suzanne that this is a living work, not just a work that we document. So we had to undertake the long process of building a community of collaborators, of old ladies from outside the art world, and reenacting a work main stage in the Turbine Hall. And I remain incredibly grateful to Suzanne for absolutely insisting that if we were going to represent her work and work of her community, we had to literally tear down another institutional barrier. So I often use this juxtaposition as a shorthand to describe the development of the collection over that 10-year period. And it's a juxtaposition of a kind of classic modernist work on the left-hand side of the screen, Kandinsky's Cossacks of 1910, a work acquired in the 1920s, and representing a key moment in modernism as artists sort of drove their way towards abstraction. It's rooted in real life. It's a moment associated with the Russian Revolution, as you can just see the Cossacks with their red hats on the right-hand side of the painting, but they're disappearing into a language of sensation and colour and form. Classic moment from Western art history, juxtaposed on the right-hand side with a work of a non-Western artist, Cuban performance artist Tania Bruguera, Tatlin's Whisper from 2008. Again, the equestrian motif, the horse, at the centre of Tania's work. But instead of retreating from the real world, she rushes towards it. This is a reenactment of police manoeuvres and how police manoeuvre crowds in riot situations, happening at surprise moments in the gallery, vividly confronting the audience with the experience of being kettled. One work made in the studio, the other work completed on the street, abstraction compared to real life, retreat to engagement, a kind of personal experience, that kind of the weeper experience with public engagement, the gallery, public space, viewer, participant, experience and participation. All of that fed into the need for a new and different type of spaces to reflect a radically challenging type of artistic practice in the early 21st century, combined, of course, with vastly increased appetite from our public in London for more active forms of engagement. And those were the things that drove the development of the new Tate Modern, which, as Gregory said, opened in June 2016. And we were lucky enough to be able to extend our footprint and our ambitions by building on our incredible as-found spaces south of the Tate, the former oil tanks. And as you can see, a bigger story required 336,000 bricks and has enabled us to include 80 artists from 50 countries in a truly, again, a really significantly reworked collection display. And I just thought there's an aerial view of the Tate Modern. I might have a PR moment if I can work this. Now, how do I press on? Have you got any? What's that? No? Anybody know how this works?
Hold the text.
Hold what? Pause the timer. How do I do that?
Is it next?
It should be. This is a film here. No? I can't show you the film. Okay, well, I won't show you the film. In fact, it probably would have been a bit embarrassing because I was going to show you one of those fantastically sort of celebratory film where the stars of Tate Modern talk in glowing terms about this is the first museum to do this, that and the other, and you see thousands of people at the opening party and it's all very glamorous. And maybe the reality is that that was just a PR film, but I will show you this, and appropriately enough, and denoting a very significant shift towards public engagement. When we reopened Tate Modern, the new Tate Modern, we open not with a commission of a physical structure, but with a vast work of art, this is it, called The Weather Project by Peter Liversidge, which was a performance created with over 30 community choirs from all across South London. It was absolute kind of symbol that the new Tate Modern was a people's museum. The new building, and I'm just going to show you this kind of cutaway, incredibly complex, huge, was very much engaged and designed to articulate that shift. And the new building you can see on the right-hand side with a stack of galleries and lots and lots of public space here and lots of art from here downwards. But the key spaces in underpinning our thinking were this space up here, Tate Exchange, and then these fantastic, I showed you the picture earlier, these tanks down below. Tate Exchange. In a way, this is the most exciting thing about the new Tate Modern. It's a space which isn't just ours, it's a space that we manage with 50 associate organisations. They range from art schools and universities to local radio stations, health organisations, feminist collectives, and they take over the space in collaboration with Tate, for sure, but more crucially with their partners. And their partners bring their partners. And what we're beginning to see in this space is kind of the collapse of that old division between the authority of the museum and the kind of receptiveness of the audience, and between making art and consuming art. And those were the things that so defined the character of the museum from its inception. Making happened outside, experience and interpretation happened inside. So Tate Exchange is open to all visitors every day, it's free. Anybody can walk in, they can be involved for as long or as little as they like. They can participate or they can watch, they can wait, they can come back. It's a place where ideas are explored through very different registers, from kind of play, and I'm a great believer in play, and making, so coding to crochet, and also debate. And debate very much fostered by the people occupying that space, the associates who are occupying that week. So kind of in place of the museum echo chamber, and we're all part of that echo chamber, where ideas are contained within a closed system, like the prison cell or the white cube. This is a space which taps into much more complex modes of communication and networks and relationships. And ideas explored in one area, this area, can then reverberate through complex journeys through time and space, both to outside and can be worked through the associates up and down the country, or indeed into the curatorial team. So this is a space that's generating incredibly interesting ideas, conversations and new relationships. But crucially, I think, for new audiences, and its draw is particularly to people who otherwise might not have come into the institution, it is a place that you can ask difficult questions. You might not find the answers, but it's a place where you can take personal risks. It's a place for experiencing difference. You meet different people there from different communities. You look at works of art in different ways, from different perspectives, and it is a place of empathy. The agreed mission, as stated, and all the associates sign up to this, is that it's a space for everyone to collaborate, test ideas, and discover new perspectives on life through art. And the core values that have been, discussed ad infinitum over 18 months, but agreed on, are trust, risk, openness, and generosity. And that generosity thing actually has just been incredible. It's a very, very open, generous space. The Tate Exchange was very much a response to an increasing sense that audiences, and especially new audiences, ask much more of art and artists than they used to. It's a complex world, and art is a complex thing. What does it mean? What is it about? What's it for me? And of course, the roots of that really go no further back than the 1960s, when artists themselves began to ask more of their audiences. Don't just stand there and stare, but get up, move around, pick it up, complete the work. So Tate Exchange is kind of rooted in a sequence of displays in that building, now called the Blavatnik Building, which are grounded in that idea, that moment when art became active. And the opening display was a very bold, risk-taking venture on our half. It may not look like it, but the works in this room, particularly these mirror cubes by Robert Morris in the centre, and the large work by Rashid Areen, mirror cubes in front, large work by Rashid Areen in the centre, and you can see these grey cubes at the back by Charlotte Poznanska. First of all, they were works that had never occupied the same history together, though they were all absolutely coterminous in terms of their their birth. They happened at the same time in different parts of the world. But they're all works that we had previously shown on plinths, behind barriers, with protection and alarms and guards, and now they're in the gallery for people to walk around, touch, smear, rebuild, slam doors, so returning them to that idea of art when art became active. And I think that was a really a brave thing on behalf of the conservation team to allow us to do that. But across the whole of the new Tate Modern, really the notion of an interconnected world, accessible from many entry points and levels of knowledge, acknowledging interconnected histories and without a hierarchy of significance, accommodating new temporalities, and with a very major commitment to surfacing, celebrating the hidden histories of women's practice, and embracing craft and performance as areas of formerly marginal activity but centre stage. To evidence this very significant shift, I've just got a couple of before and after images. Actually, this was one of my favourite displays in the old Tate Modern. It was a room that I installed probably around 2006 of American minimalism, and it was just looked incredible. Very precise work made by a community of artists who knew each other in one city within a decade. Robert Morris, Carl Andre, Jard, Solowurt, Jo Bear. Actually, they wouldn't have wanted Jo Bear there because she was a female and she made paintings, but that was a moment of revenge. But that absolutely, site-specific, and America owns minimalism. They own the word, they actually don't own the practice, because what we have been discovering through our acquisitions and our travels, that this movement away from the kind of pictorial focus of the work in static mode was very, very widely shared across the world, and was particularly pioneered in Latin America and, dare I say it, in the UK. And a fantastic piece on the back wall by Mary Martin, a less well-known British sculptor, but making extraordinary innovative work in the 1960s. Charlotte Poznanska, great German artist, David Medalla, Yayoi Kusama, Christina Iglesias in the top, Rachel Whiteread. So a whole range of practices involved in this expanded notion of sculpture, and truly international and very, very legible, very much interconnected. You can see the dialogues between these works. You can see how Carl Andre is an absolute dialogue with Shalawat Choucair from Lebanon, even though her work was made 10 years earlier than Carl Andre's, part of the same sensibility. Another before and after is this is a transitional room in the old Tate Modern, just before we reinstalled for the new, a room that looked at the aftermath of the Second World War, that moment of kind of fragile figuration, existential kind of isolation, Matter, Richier, early Pollock and Matisse. But of course, the whole world was impacted, not just by the Second World War, but by the aftermath of the atomic bomb, by those moments of decolonization, by civil war. The world changed, and artists across the world confronted the figure as a site of interrogation. So Germaine Richier's wonderful Czech players in front, but then Ibrahim El Salah, Dorothea Tanning, Norman Lewis, very important black American abstract expressionist, and so on and so forth. A really, really powerful display of a kind of international zeitgeist. We look back, but we also looked forward in the new Tate Modern. And these very, very important thematic rooms interspersed with incredible solo presentations of great contemporary artists, many of whom are female and deserve global recognition. Jane Alexander, amazing artist working in South Africa, dealing with very, very difficult issues around the sort of legacy of apartheid and corruption in contemporary South Africa. Incredible work of Anna Lupash. We have discovered great modernist innovators working behind the Iron Curtain, and their visibility since 1989, when the wall came down, has just been at a snail's pace. So it really feels that we have a responsibility to move Europe eastwards, to incorporate some of these extraordinary secret and lesser-known histories. Wonderful works by people like Silda Morellas, Babel from 2001, 2,000 radios, each one set to a different station, a kind of international nonsense talk. And all of that supported at the same time by the museum as an expansive organisation. We're not a museum that will ever build Tates anywhere else, but goodness me, we're going to have friendships and relationships and alliances all over the world, actively a conversation that we can learn so much from. I began this lecture with a prison, and appropriately for the world in which we live, where forced migration and uncertainty are facts of life for so many, I'm going to end it with a tent. That prison at Milbank was the gathering and departure point for several generations of prisoners shipped by His Majesty's government to Australia. And you remember, I think, that Brits in Australia are still routinely referred to as POMs. And POMs stands for Prisoners of Milbank. So it seems especially appropriate that this tent, which we will install at the centre of Tate Modern in our Turbine Hall next summer, is the tent, an Australian tent, fashioned by the Australian Aboriginal artist Richard Bell, and one of the first works by an Indigenous artist Tate has acquired as a result of a partnership to collect with the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney and funded by Qantas. So addressing perceived ideas of Aboriginal art and raising issues of identity, place and politics, the same issues that the Indigenous Aboriginal artists are addressing here, this tent will bring, of course, into the space of the museum a very different kind of institutional history, and I hope shed light on our history. It recalls the 1972 Aboriginal Tent Embassy established in Canberra to challenge the status, treatment and rights of Aboriginal people, bound therefore by invisible ties to the institutional history of Tate, through Milbank Prison, through Tate Gallery and now Tate Modern. And it will help us navigate the past, and it will also be a place for articulating those issues today, and I think imagining a future, because actually that's the role of a museum of art history. Like all great works of art, as I said earlier, it can travel across geography and through time, and I think it will take its audience with it. And I've no doubt that it too will be a kind of Trojan horse, taking Tate's collection, its curators and its communities onto the next and as yet unknown stage of our journey. I hope you'll join me on that journey. Thank you.